Our endocrine system, it's made out of hormones in which glands without a duct secretes them into the plasma. So that's going to be the hormones that are floating in your plasma, and then they're going to target a specific cell for its action. Okay. Now, if you compare it to the nervous system exerts a point-to-point control by using nerves. The endocrine system utilizes hormones. Instead of using a nerve, it actually secretes it to the circulation, distant to the body cell, and this will produce a response, a physiologic response of specific cells. Now, this picture shows you how a neuron stimulates a target tissue. So there's going to be a target tissue, and your target tissue is going to be muscle, okay? And this looks like the cardiac muscle, okay? So this is a neuron with dendrites and cell body together with the axon. Now, at the end of the axon, there's actually chemicals, what we call neurotransmitters, that are secreted by the end of the axon, located at the synapse. Now, these chemicals or neurotransmitters, the one that will produce an effect on the cell membrane of the target tissue. It has a receptor for those neurotransmitters. And for this purpose, this is a cardiac muscle that will produce cardiac contraction, okay? So this is what a neuron does. It has a nerve that produces this effect, okay? But with our hormones, we don't have a nerve, okay? So we don't have a nerve. The only thing we have is glands, cells that secrete. And the cells are glands from the hormones, okay, of the endocrine system. And if you notice, they secrete the hormones and they pass it on to the bloodstream, okay? So they don't utilize a neuron. And then from the bloodstream, it then goes into a specific cell, target cell, that will respond with a hormone, okay? So the specific target cell has a receptor that will respond to the hormones, okay? So cells that have no receptors for this hormone will not produce an effect, okay? Now, hormones, they travel slowly because they never use nerve impulses, so they use the blood, so they travel slowly. So that's the reason why the endocrine system mainly controls the slow processes of your body, such as growth and metabolism. We can divide the endocrine glands, okay? It depends, is it pure endocrine or is it partly endocrine? So I'm going to identify here the specific pure endocrine organ. So the example is going to be the pineal gland. Remember, the pineal gland is located at the epithalamus. So that is specifically just for endocrine secretion. And the secretion of that is called the melatonin. Now, the other gland is located beneath the hypothalamus. That is going to be called your pituitary gland. Okay, so pituitary gland is specific only for endocrine secretion. Another gland called the thyroid gland, just located below the trachea, within the second cartilage of the trachea. And that is specific only for endocrine secretion. And the one located at the back of the thyroid gland, we call it the parathyroid gland. It's only endocrine. Now, the other one is going to be the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is located on the top of the kidney. And this is specific, purely endocrine organ. Now, the other types we're going to be identifying are glands that are partly endocrine. So if you take a look at the hypothalamus located below the thalamus, that is partly endocrine. So it's release what we call our releasing hormones. They'll control the pituitary gland, but it also has some connection to the nervous system in which it controls all your information coming out from the spinal cord and to the brainstem. So that is the hypothalamus. This is partly endocrine. Another one is the thymus gland. So the thymus gland secretes thymosin hormone, but the main purpose of this also is to mature your white blood cells, the lymphocytes. And the next one is the pancreas. Now the pancreas, about 10% of this is only endocrine, so they secrete insulin and glucagon. So majority function of the pancreas is to secrete your digestive enzymes, and that's part of the digestive process. So this is also partly endocrine. And the last one is going to be your gonads. Testes for the male, ovaries for the female. Remember, the gonads are for reproduction, but it also secretes hormones by the male called testosterone, and the ovaries for the female is estrogen. So this information is about the classes of hormones. Now, the classes of hormones can either be amino acid based, which is going to be your protein, and most of the hormones are actually amino acid based, and then it's made out of proteins. So remember, functional unit of proteins is amino acid chains, and then modified amino acid peptides are examples also. And this is what it looks like as a hormone, which is amino acid based. So each one of these units are called amino acids. And then each of them is actually connected by what we call peptide bonds. Now, peptide bonds create what we call the proteins. So an example is the parathyroid hormone, right? Now, the other one is going to be steroid base. And steroid base is derived from what we call cholesterol. Now, the amino acid base, they're actually hormones that cannot penetrate the cell wall. This is going to be in your physiology class. So the receptors of the amino acid based hormones are going to be located at the cell membrane. So the steroid one is going to be the one that is made out of lipids, which is cholesterol derived. And remember, the cell membrane is made out of lipids. So the steroid hormone, they affect the target cell not through the cell membrane, but the receptors located at the cytoplasm. And that's because it is lipid based. Another thing about your steroid hormones, they're mostly sex hormones, and they're mostly commonly seen also in the adrenal cortex hormones. That is going to be your steroid base. Okay. Now, this is what a cholesterol, a cortisol hormone looks like. Okay. It's made out of your cholesterol unit. So the cortisol is an example of what we call a steroid hormone. Another thing that we have to talk about, okay, which is actually how the hormone is controlled. Because remember, you should have a normal level of your hormones in your body. Too much of that will produce what we call hyper, and too low, hypo. And you need to have a normal value of those hormones. So how do we control the hormones in order to maintain a normal value? There's three methods of control. One is called humor or humoral. That means it's a chemical that is actually the one that is controlling this hormone. The other one is neural, and this is through nerves. And then hormonal control is the hormone itself, okay, that controls the number of hormones in our body. So the first type of control we're going to be looking at is called humor. Now, this example is going to be through the calcium concentration, okay? So the humoral control of the hormones is based on the calcium level in the blood. An example is going to be if there's a low calcium level in the blood, the concentration is low in the blood, it will trigger the parathyroid gland to secrete what we call the parathormone, okay? Because what's the purpose of the parathormone? The parathormone is to increase calcium level in the blood. Since the humor calcium level is low, the parathyroid gland is going to be stimulated to secrete the parathyroid hormone. Parathormone, once it's secreted, it will affect the kidneys, the intestines, and the bone. And the purpose of that is to increase calcium level. So on the kidneys, what's going to happen is it's going to conserve calcium. It's not going to be excreted out. And also, it will also activate vitamin D, because the vitamin D from the milk has to be activated in order for it to be used by your intestinal tract. So when the vitamin D is activated through the kidneys, it will then, not just the kidneys, also by the skin, it will then stimulate the intestinal tract to absorb calcium. So again, an increase in absorption of the calcium will then increase the calcium level in the blood. And the bone will actually tell the bone to release the stored calcium, because remember, what is on the matrix of the bone? That is calcium. So the calcium is the one that's actually stored by the bone. And when it is being stimulated by the parathormone, it will tell the bone to release calcium. So the total effect of these three activities after the stimulation of parathormone is to increase the calcium level in the blood. So now, When the calcium level in blood becomes elevated, that will then produce a negative feedback to the endocrine gland. So since the calcium level is now approaching normal value, it will then tell the endocrine gland, which is the parathyroid gland, to stop secreting the parathormone. And that's how this type of hormone is actually being controlled. Humoral is, the calcium is just one of the humoral control. Another example would be your glucose. So the amount of glucose in the blood will trigger an effect either to secrete insulin or decrease glucagon, okay? And we'll talk about that once we go to the specific gland. The next control is going to be the neural control. So there's only one neural control, and that's going to be by the sympathetic nervous system to the adrenal medulla. Now, remember, the sympathetic nervous system is for a fight, flight, or fright response. The purpose of this is to make you aware of your environment. Either you're going to need to be fighting to go flight or become frightened. And that is how this control of the hormone is going to actually be affected. So remember, the adrenal gland medulla. So if you have an adrenal gland and cut it in half, you'll notice that the middle part of that is called the medulla. Now, the medulla is the one that secretes what we call the adrenaline hormone. So now, how does it actually become controlled? It is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So when the sympathetic nervous system triggers a response, it will activate the fight, flight, or fright response. And the preganglionic neuron located at the sympathetic chain ganglia would then stimulate the adrenal medulla. And once the adrenal medulla is stimulated, it will actually release adrenaline hormone in the blood, okay? So an increase in adrenaline hormone is to support the fight, flight, or fright response, okay? So that's actually how this hormone, adrenaline hormone, is controlled. And that's through the sympathetic nervous system. So when adrenal hormone triggers into the body, it will produce a fight, flight, or fright response. Now, the last control is generally the hormone level itself, okay? On the hormone level itself, there's going to be two activities of the hypothalamus and the adrenal hypophysis. The adrenal hypophysis is called the anterior pituitary gland, okay? So the anterior pituitary gland secretes hormones, but the hypothalamus secretes hormones that controls the anterior pituitary gland. Now, when the hormone level becomes elevated, okay, such as the thyroxine level becomes elevated, or the cortisol level becomes elevated, or the androgenic hormone becomes elevated, and this will then produce a negative feedback. So the negative feedback will be coming out from the secretion of these hormones and will tell the anterior pituitary gland stop secreting. It'll also tell the hypothalamus to stop secreting. So stop secretion of the hypothalamus would stop the anterior pituitary gland from secreting, and then the peripheral endocrine gland will stop also secretion of this specific hormone. And this is through the levels of the hormone. Now, the example is going to be the hypothalamus release what we call a releasing hormone. It'll affect the anterior pituitary gland called adrenal hypophysis, and this will then release what we call stimulating hormones. Once the stimulating hormones are released, it will specifically go to specific tissue. One is going to be going to the thyroid gland through what we call the thyroid stimulating hormone coming out to the anterior pituitary gland. And once the thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland, it will then produce what we call thyroxine hormone. Okay. And thyroxine hormone is to increase metabolic activity, and that's the purpose of that hormone. Okay. Now, the other one is going to be a hormone coming out from the adrenal hypophysis, which is going to be your adrenal corticotropic hormone. Adrenal corticotropic hormone is what we call ACTH. Now, adrenal cortical hormone specifically stimulates the adrenal cortex. So the one of the hormones that will release would be cortisol, and then cortisol is going to be it's actually going to be floating in your blood, and then it will tell all cells to produce an anti-stress effect. Now, the other one is going to be hormones coming out from your anterior pituitary gland and stimulates the gonads. And this is specifically our FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and our luteinizing hormone. These are the hormones coming out from your anterior pituitary gland. Now, this will tell the gonads, hey, gonads, secrete your hormone. In this case, this is located in the testes. So the hormone that will be secreted is going to be androgenic hormone, which is your testosterone. And the purpose of this is to produce sperm maturation. Since we stimulated a lot of these glands that is from the peripheral endocrine glands, such as your thyroxine, that hormone, your adrenocorticotropic hormone, and your thyroid stimulating hormone. This hormone, once it becomes elevated, it will then tell the anterior pituitary gland, hey, stop. It also tell the hypothalamus to stop, okay? Though when there's actually no stimulation by the hypothalamus with its releasing hormones, no stimulation by the anterior pituitary gland, which is stimulating hormones, then the levels of the hormones here will level up to normal levels, right? So this is how most of our hormones are controlled, by the amount of the hormone itself. So more often it is based on physiology, but I want you to understand it so we can understand the anatomy of this part, okay? So again, you got this feedback loops. So the normal hormone levels, okay? Now if it's too high for that hormone level, it will actually produce what we call the receptors of the hormone control mechanisms to sense change. It will then go to the control center where the endocrine gland is located at. It will inhibit that endocrine gland, and the effector is going to be a decrease in the hormone secretion. And once the hormone secretion is decreased, it will then turn to normal levels, okay? That is when it's too high. When it's too low, it is a stimulation of the hormone levels dropping, or controlled process decreases, and then it will act on the receptors that sense the change of low hormone level, and it will tell the control center to stimulate the specific endocrine gland, and the effector is going to actually be hormone secretion increase, okay? And then once it goes up, it will go to its normal level, and then you achieve homeostasis. So it becomes normal level again. And that's actually what we call the feedback loop. So after talking to you about physiology, about hormone control, let's talk about the structures and what are the functions of the hormone. So we're going to start with a major endocrine organ called the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is just located hanging down at the hypothalamus. So if you remember our anatomy, the hypothalamus, below the thalamus, this is your hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the one that controls this structure that dangles down to the bottom called your pituitary gland. Okay, so it's the pituitary gland is located at the depression on the structure of the sphenoid bone called your sella turcica. All right, so now we know how the pituitary gland is, where the pituitary gland is located at. So let's take a look at the specific pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland can be divided into two parts. The one located in the front is called your anterior pituitary gland, and then the one located at the back is called your posterior pituitary gland. When you hear about the word anterior pituitary gland, another name for that is called adenohypophysis. Okay, and then when you hear about the posterior pituitary gland, sometimes we call it the pars nervosa, and that's going to be your neurohypophysis. Now, another thing about that pituitary gland is it's actually connected to the hypothalamus, and that connection is called your infundibulum. That is where the pituitary gland dangles below the hypothalamus. We call it an infundibulum. If you take a look at your anterior pituitary gland, okay, there's actually different areas of the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to be the location of its region, okay? The first one is going to be the pars tuberalis. Pars tuberalis is part of the anterior pituitary gland located here, close to the infundibulum, okay? And that's called your pars tuberalis. Next, you have the pars distalis. The pars distalis is the main tissue of the anterior pituitary gland. That's your pars distalis. And there's another one, we call it a pars intermedia, which is just in the middle portion of close to the mid portion between the two pituitary glands. Okay, so these are the different parts. Now, the posterior pituitary gland, we also call that the pars nervosa. Okay, and that is actually our location. But we're gonna look at the anterior pituitary gland first. Okay, so we're gonna take a look at what it secretes. Okay, on your anterior pituitary gland. Now, remember, another name for anterior pituitary gland is adenohypophysis. That's another name. Now, what are the different regions of the adenohypophysis? It's called the pars distalis, the pars intermedia, and the pars tuberalis. Okay, but let's concentrate on the pars distalis. So there's less amount of information that we could get out from the intermedia and tuberalis, but we have more information on the pars distalis. So this pars distalis is the largest division of your adenohypophysis. It actually contains 5 different endocrine cells. So the 5 different endocrine cells secrete 7 different hormones. Classify the different hormones that the adenohypophysis pars distalis secretes. Okay, so when they look at the anterior pituitary gland, they noted that there's 5 different cell classes there, and they named those 5 classes. So they call the most abundant one somatotrophic cell. Somatotrophic, somato means body. So somatotrophic cell is the cell that specifically secretes your growth hormone. Another one is called mammotrophic cell. The mammotrophic cell specifically secretes what we call prolactin hormone. Now they notice another cell called thyrotrophic cell, and they notice that the thyrotrophic cell secretes the hormone called TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. And then next to the last one is called corticotropic cells. That specific cell secretes actually 2 hormones. One hormone is called your ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone. Just remember the word adrenocortical, meaning it affects the adrenal cortex of your adrenal gland. Okay, so that is actually what hormone comes out from the corticotropic cell. And another hormone is the melanocyte stimulating hormone. Then the SAGE hormone, that is coming out from the corticotropic cell. And the last of these cells called the gonadotropic cells, or what we call the gonadotropins. Now, the hormones that it releases is going to be FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and your LH, the luteinizing hormone. Okay, so the 5 cells secrete 7 different hormones, right? Now, let's try to figure out how to memorize them, because remember, I noticed that most of the cells, some of the cells actually are stimulating hormones. What does stimulating hormone mean, or what we call your trophic hormone? These are hormones that does not affect the cells around the body, but it specifically affects another gland, okay, in order to release that specific hormones for that specific gland. So I got my thyroid stimulating hormone, I got my adrenocorticotropic hormone, specifically at the adrenal cortex, and I have my follicle stimulating hormone. It affects the gonads, and I have my luteinizing hormone, and it affects the gonads. Okay, so these are generally the hormones that influence another gland. Okay, we call it stimulating or a trophic hormone. Right now, the way to actually divide this is to change its color. Okay, now the reason why I changed one is red and the other one's green, because the red ones are what we call trophic hormones. Okay, so trophic hormones regulates the secretion of hormones by other endocrine gland. So I call it flat. Okay, and the green ones are called act directly on non-endocrine target tissue. So they don't secrete and they don't influence another gland, but specifically right away produce an effect on a specific cell. Okay, so I call it miles per gallon flat, or what we call MPG flat. So these are the 7 hormones that we have at our anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so let's take a look at this function. Now, the growth hormone is the growth of the entire body. Okay, sometimes we call it the somatotropin, or what we call somatotropic hormone. But generally, its acronym is GH, growth hormone. So it's the growth of the entire body. Then next is prolactin hormone. The function of that is for breast milk production. But remember, the only thing it does is produce milk. But milk ejection is handled by a different hormone. M is your melanocyte stimulating hormone. So what it does, it actually stimulates the melanocytes to produce more melanin pigment. And that's quite specific on pregnancy. So those women that are pregnant, sometimes you see a black line in the middle of their abdomen. That is actually caused by the MSH hormone called melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now, the next one is going to be your FLAT. Okay, and what is FLAT? FLAT is your F, follicle stimulating hormone, L, luteinizing hormone, and the purpose for this is for maturation of sex cells. So what it does is it literally tells the cells on the gonads to secrete their hormones. Because remember, it is just a trophic hormone. So the gonads, the ovaries on females, once the FSH hormone or the luteinizing hormone actually stimulate the ovary will then secrete what we call estrogen. Okay. And then on the male, when it actually tells the testes, the FSH and LH hormone, it will then stimulate the testes into producing what we call testosterone. And then we have our A. A is called adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, it is a tropic hormone. So when the adrenocorticotropic hormone is released by the anterior pituitary gland, it will then stimulate the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland and produce what we call glucocorticoids or mineralocorticoids or your androgenic hormones. So that's coming out from ACTH. And the last one is going to be your TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. This hormone, when it's released by the anterior pituitary gland, it will then tell the thyroid gland to secrete the thyroxine hormone. So that is how trophic hormones react, okay? So we now know the 7 hormones in our anterior pituitary gland, and you can have that definition here again on this table, okay? But we went through that, and let's move on to the next one. So now, we did study the pars distalis, okay? But let's talk about a little bit about the pars intermedia and tuberalis. Now, the pars intermedia and tuberalis component, they haven't yet understood what they have, but they know that the pars intermedia contains corticotropic cells, and tuberalis also contains gonadotropic, thyrotropic, and as far as tuberalis, they're generally receptors for melatonin. Now, let's take a look at the relationship between hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary gland, and the peripheral endocrine glands. All right, so as I said, the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus have hormones, we call it a releasing hormone, or sometimes an inhibiting hormone, okay? So the growth hormone, releasing hormone, that will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release growth hormone. Now, the somatostatin hormone located at your hypothalamus, this is producing what we call a negative feedback, or what we call an inhibition into the anterior pituitary gland, and it will tell that anterior pituitary gland to stop secreting growth hormone. Then we have the prolactin hormone. The prolactin hormone is located at your anterior pituitary gland, and when your prolactin releasing factor coming out from the hypothalamus release, that will then generate a positive feedback using what we call the prolactin hormone. But it also has an inhibiting hormone. We call it a prolactin release inhibiting hormone, or PIH. Once it is secreted, then it will tell the prolactin to stop secretion. So you don't have prolactin secretion, just as when a person is not pregnant, then there should be no reason why the mother should be able to still have breast milk production, okay? But remember, breast milk production is continuous as long as the infant is still taking out the milk out from the mother's breast, okay? But generally, if there's no action similar to that one, then it will then tell the hypothalamus to secrete PIH hormone, and the PIH hormone will tell the anterior pituitary gland to stop secreting prolactin, thus decreasing or preventing milk production on the times when a woman is not pregnant. Okay. Now, the hypothalamus release what we call the thyrotropin releasing hormone. This will then affect the interpituitary gland to release the thyroid stimulating hormone. And then it will then tell the thyroid gland to secrete your thyroxine hormone. And then your corticotrophin releasing hormone from your hypothalamus will tell the interpituitary gland to secrete your adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then from there, it goes to the blood and it will tell the adrenal cortex to secrete their specific hormone. The cortisol, aldosterone, and your secondary sex hormone, which is going to be your androgenic hormone. And then after that, the last one is going to be your gonadotropic releasing hormone coming out from the hypothalamus. This will then tell the interpituitary gland to release your FSH hormone or the luteinizing hormone. And those are the hormones that will tell the gonads to secrete the specific hormone. So generally, all these target cells, like the growth hormone, that will be the enlargement of the bone, enlargement of the muscle, production of adipose tissue, and coming out from your anterior pituitary gland, that will be the prolactin hormone being stimulated, then tells the mammary gland to produce milk. Okay, so it's direct acting, and then your stimulating hormone, the thyroid stimulating hormone, will tell the thyroid gland to secrete thyroxine hormone, and then the ACTH hormone from the anterior pituitary gland will then secrete what we call the ACTH hormone, telling the adrenal cortex to secrete cortisol, aldosterone, and your androgenic hormone. Okay, and then the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone will tell the ovary and the testes. For the ovary, it will secrete estrogen and testosterone. Okay, now since we have all these hormones, okay, that are actually floating in the blood, growth hormone, prolactin hormone, thyroxine hormone, cortisol, aldosterone, and androgenic hormone, estrogen, and testosterone, everything now is floating in the blood. So now, when it becomes elevated, okay, it will then produce a negative feedback. So the amount of hormone located in the blood will tell everything here, like the hypothalamus, hey, hypothalamus, stop stimulating the pituitary gland. It will also tell the pituitary gland and pituitary gland to say, stop stimulating the other glands or stop producing your hormone. And that's what we call a negative feedback. Okay, so that's the reason why we call it a negative feedback, because remember, negative feedback is to control the levels of the hormone in the blood. Okay, so an elevated amount of the hormone that is in the blood, it will then tell your hypothalamus and your anterior pituitary gland to stop. Okay, that is what a negative feedback is. Just stop. Okay, and that's how we get normal levels. Okay, so that's the hypothalamic control of the adrenal hypothesis. So now let's move on to the next one. Now, what do you call the hypophyseal portal? The portal system is a portal or a blood vessel or a complex of blood vessel that will deliver the hormone coming out from here at the hypothalamus. So remember, the hormone is coming out from the hypothalamus. Then that hormone will be deposited into the blood vessel called the portal blood. We call it a complex, primary capillary complex. And then when the hormone floats from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland, then it will then stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete its own hormone. And then after it actually secretes its own hormone, then it will then deliver it to the secondary capillary complex and then brings that blood hormones into the circulation. So this is called your portal system. Remember, the anterior pituitary gland the hormones are secreted in the blood. So it needs a portal system to deliver that hormone into the areas, okay? And that's called the portal system, hypophyseal portal system, okay? All right, so now let's talk about the last part, posterior pituitary gland, okay? There's only two hormones there, okay? So the posterior pituitary gland is called the pars nervosa. And these are the different parts: median eminence, infundibular stalk, pars nervosa, But we're going to concentrate ourselves on the pars nervosa because some of them are not yet understood, okay, what they do. But we're going to talk about the pars nervosa, and those are where the hormones are actually secreted. But remember, the hypothalamus also influences the posterior pituitary gland, but not the same way as the anterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus, okay, has neurons, cell body, dendrites, and axon, and they're the one that actually goes deep down into the posterior pituitary gland. Now, the hormone is actually produced inside the neuron, okay? So the neurons are located at the hypothalamus. So the hormone that is secreted by the posterior pituitary gland is made by the neuron in the hypothalamus. So that hormone, once it's produced, it will then descend down. The hormone produced in the hypothalamus, it will descend down to this part here called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, and that's still part of the neuron. And then after that, once the neuron reaches the posterior pituitary gland, then it will then secrete the hormone to this hypophyseal artery. So the hypophyseal artery would then release that into the blood circulation. Okay, so it's not similar to the anterior pituitary gland, in which the anterior pituitary gland secretes hormone from the hypothalamus, and that hormone will have to travel to a portal system and influence the anterior pituitary gland to secrete its own hormone. Okay, but on the neurohypophysis, or what we call the posterior pituitary gland, okay, the posterior pituitary gland, the hormones are created at the hypothalamus, but it's passed on to the axon of that neuron down into this area called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, and the hormones then released down here at the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, and that's the reason we call it neurohypophysis, because the hormone is created by the nerve or the axon. Okay, that is actually where that hormone is secreted by. So now the two hormones that are seen on the posterior pituitary gland is what we call ADH hormone, antidiuretic hormone. The word tells you what it is. Antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that prevents you from urinating, okay? But it's not saying you don't urinate. It's just telling you to urinate less water. So what happens is when the body senses dehydration, it will tell the posterior pituitary gland, hey, secrete ADH hormone. And then the ADH hormone will tell the kidney, hey, kidney, bring back the water, okay? You can urinate, but make the water, conserve the water, bring it back because my patient is dehydrated, okay? So what the ADH hormone does, it prevents you from urinating the water, but you're still urinating, but it's more concentrated. And that is an example similar to if you're in the desert, okay, you're actually a little bit dehydrated. So when you're dehydrated, the body will sense dehydration from the brain, and it will then produce ADH hormone. The antidiuretic hormone will be released down to the posterior pituitary gland to the circulation. It'll tell the kidneys, hey, I want the water back, okay? So in the event you're going to be urinating concentrated urine, okay? Urine is going to be dark yellow compared to if you're not in the desert, if you're not dehydrated. So antidiuretic hormone conserves water. It brings back the water, okay? Telling the kidney, stop urinating it. Now, that is ADH hormone. And the other hormone is called oxytocin hormone, okay? Now, you know about oxytocin. So you'll always hear oxytocin on uterine contraction. These are the medicine that we inject, okay, to the pregnant woman. We inject oxytocin in order to retain normal uterine contraction on delivery, okay? So when the mother is actually contracting and it's not regular, let's say every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes, and we want the contraction to every 3 to 5 minutes, okay, then we inject oxytocin, okay? Oxytocin is to initiate labor from uterine contraction, okay? And that's what we inject on pregnancy. We want contraction every 3 to 5 minutes, okay? Because remember, when the uterus contracts every 3 to 5 minutes, it opens up the cervix, Okay, when you want to open up the cervix, the baby's head can go through. Okay, and that's one of the oxytocin function is for uterine contraction. But there's another one for that purpose of oxytocin. Oxytocin is for milk ejection from the breast. Okay, the milk from the breast created by the prolactin hormone does not eject by itself. Okay, and that's the reason why some women become engorged with milk. Okay, and it feels painful because it's engorged with milk, doesn't eject out. The only time it becomes ejected out from the breast is through the nipple stimulation from the sucking reflex of the baby. Okay, when the baby sucks on the nipple, it will actually then tell the posterior pituitary gland, "Hey, secrete oxytocin." And the oxytocin will then go down into the breast gland milk, okay, and secrete the milk, okay. And that is actually what oxytocin does. Okay, it has to have a stimulus for the milk to be ejected out, and the stimulus is going to be nipple stimulation from the baby sucking reflex. Okay, and that's oxytocin. So that is another purpose of oxytocin: milk ejection. Okay, not just uterine contraction. A summary of our pituitary gland. Okay, so we talk about our anterior pituitary gland. Remember, these are 7 hormones called mpg flat. Okay, so the 7 hormones called miles per gallon flat. Okay, melanocyte stimulating hormone. It's actually sensitizing the melanocytes to produce melanin. Prolactin hormone is for milk production. Growth hormone is for growth on the body. Okay, that is called mpg. Okay, and these are direct acting. Now, what is flat? Flat are trophic hormones. So what it does, it actually influences another gland to secrete hormones. Your FSH hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone is actually to mature the sperm and the egg. Adrenocorticotropic hormone tells the adrenal cortex to secrete its own hormone, and the thyroid stimulating hormone tells the thyroid gland to secrete its hormone, the thyroxine hormone. So these are the 7 hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and the posterior has only 2, ADH and your oxytocin. Okay, the purpose of oxytocin is for milk ejection, and the purpose of oxytocin is for uterine contraction. Okay, so those are the summary of our pituitary gland. Okay, now let's talk about other major organ glands. Now, thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is like a bow tie located between tracheal ring 2. Okay, that's actually where that ring 2, meaning tracheal cartilage ring 2nd. Okay, and that's where the thyroid gland is located at. Okay, so if you take a look at inside the thyroid gland, you're gonna see a lot of this colloids, or what we call pouches, and this is where your thyroxine hormone is stored. Okay, and then you see a lot of these cells surrounding that pouch. It looks like tiles from a swimming pool. Those are what we call follicular cells. Okay, and then you have cells in between the follicular cells. These are called extrafollicular cells because remember, the thyroid gland secretes 2 hormones. One is secreting the thyroxine hormone, increasing metabolic activity, and the other one is coming out from the extrafollicular cells. They're the one that secretes another hormone called calcitonin, which controls calcium level in the blood. Okay? So 2 hormones that are secreted by the thyroid gland. Okay, so thyroxine hormone and the calcitonin hormone. Thyroxine hormone is actually 2 kinds, T4 and T3. The regular one is T4. T3 is actually the same as above, except that it's more potent than thyroxine, 5 times more potent. We call it triiodothyronine. Okay, triiodothyronine, T3, T4 thyroxine. Okay, now the other one is calcitonin, and this purpose is to lower the blood calcium level, and will actually try to see the difference between the parathormone, which is to increase blood calcium level. So T3 and T4 are thyroxine hormone, and they usually have this component of that hormone, iodine. Okay. At the back of the thyroid gland, this is the back of the trachea and the pharynx. So at the back of the thyroid gland are these small seed-looking glands, small glands located at the back. And these are called parathyroid glands. Okay. And remember, the hormone that you secrete out from the thyroid gland is called the parathormone. And the purpose of the parathormone is to increase calcium level in the blood. Okay, increase calcium level in the blood. And remember, I told you that the thyroid gland secretes calcitonin, and the purpose of calcitonin is to decrease calcium level in the blood. Okay, so calcitonin and parathormone is the one that controls your calcium level in the blood. So it's like a seesaw. So the serum calcium level is controlled by calcitonin, but calcitonin decreases calcium level in the blood. See how I wrote it down? CAL, then downward arrow. So that means it decreases calcium level, and the hormone that increases calcium level is parathormone. Okay, so they go through a seesaw in which it needs to make the calcium level normal. Okay, if it's too much of calcium level, calcium's in the blood, calcitonin is going to be secreted by the thyroid gland. If it is too little of calcium level in the blood, parathormone is going to actually be secreted to increase calcium level in the blood until they go into a normal homeostatic level. Okay, so those two glands, okay, has two hormones that are actually controlling calcium level, aside from the thyroxine hormone, in which it is needed to increase metabolic activity. Okay, right. So now we talk about parathormone. So kidneys, what happened is the parathormone level, the calcium level, okay, actually decreases. Parathormone is stimulated to increase secretion. It tells the bone, hey, bone, release your calcium inside you, because bone is it's actually storing calcium. So the calcium becomes elevated. Okay, so that's how they control. And we have the parathormone. When the calcium level is actually low, the parathormone is actually secreted by the parathyroid gland. It tells the kidney, hey, kidney, conserve calcium, don't urinate it. And then it activates vitamin D. Okay, remember the vitamin D that you actually take in from milk, that's not activated yet. The way to activate it is through the kidneys, will pass through the kidney, becomes activated, or it actually becomes activated through sunlight. Okay, so the vitamin D to drink out the milk, it's not an activated form yet. So once they become activated, okay, first of all, the kidneys conserve calcium, the calcium level goes up. Once the vitamin D is activated, it tells the intestinal tract, hey, intestinal tract, absorb more calcium. So once there's an increase in the amount of calcium absorption by intestinal tract, calcium level goes up until you have a normal level of calcium level in the blood. Okay, so this is how the increased blood calcium level. Okay. All right, so now we talked about vitamin D. Okay, so remember, vitamin D is coming out from foods, and then foods actually with cholesterol, and then intestinal enzymes produce what we call provitamin D. And then this is actually goes to the skin, and the provitamin D becomes activated by sunlight. Now it becomes vitamin D. And then from vitamin D, it then goes to the liver. And then from the liver, it changes to hydroxycholecalciferol. And then from there, it goes to the kidney. The kidney changes it to dihydroxycholecalciferol, which is the active form of vitamin D. And that's the time that the intestine will absorb calcium. Okay. Now, this is now adrenal gland. Okay. Now, remember, we talk about adrenal gland when we talk about sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, once it's stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, it will then release the hormone adrenaline hormones. Okay, adrenaline hormones is to help in the fight, flight, or flight response. Okay, now there's another part of the adrenal gland called the cortex. So the cortex is separate from the medulla. The cortex is the outside portion. Okay. If I do a cross section of this, I have three layers. Okay, the capsule is the covering of the cortex of the adrenal gland. It's not one of the layer, but there's a layer called the zona glomerulosa. We call it G, glomerulosa. Then we have the zona fasciculata, we call it F. And then last one is the zona reticularis, R. Okay, so we have three layers. I call it GFR, GFR, glomerulosa, and this is the one that actually are secreting what we call your hormones, aldosterone, and this still actually secretes what we call cortisol and your androgenic hormone. So the hormones are literally the medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine, that is for the fight, flight, or flight response. Okay, and we talk about that in the sympathetic response. And the cortex has the aldosterone, cortisol, and adrenal and androgens. Aldosterone is the one that helps in the conservation of sodium. Okay, conserve sodium, because remember, when you conserve sodium, water follows. Cortisol is to decrease protein synthesis but increase fatty acid release and stimulate glucose synthesis. It actually puts that back to normal. Okay, so this is what cortisol does. Okay, it's an anti-stress hormone. And then the adrenal androgens, it's a supplemental sex hormones from the gonads. Okay, but remember, they can be converted to estrogen. All right, so that's the function of adrenal cortex, and we have here aldosterone. First, aldosterone, what it would do is it will actually stimulate, it will actually retain sodium. Okay, it will retain sodium. Okay, but there's another function of aldosterone, because remember, if your sodium level in your blood is low, decreased sodium level, your water level in your blood is low also. And then when your water level is low, it means your blood volume is low. Because remember, plasma is made of 90% water. So there's minimal amount of blood, okay, in your system. So that will also trigger the release of another hormone called renin. Okay, what does renin do? Renin, okay, the kidney will secrete renin because of a decreased blood volume, because your sodium is low. When your sodium is low, your water is low. When your water is low, the blood volume is low. When the kidney sense a decrease in blood volume, that kidney will then secrete the hormone renin. Renin will change angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Okay, that's the renin. And then angiotensin 1 will then be converted to angiotensin 2, okay, by the ACE enzyme, angiotensin converting enzyme. And then the angiotensin 2 will then stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. Okay, remember, we have a low sodium content. So now, since we have angiotensin 2 in the blood, it will tell the cortex, adrenal cortex, to secrete aldosterone. When aldosterone is secreted, then it will make the kidney conserve sodium. And then when the elevated amount of sodium, water follows. And then you have more water now, blood volume increases. Okay, so if you notice that it is always a reflex. Okay, so the study of this endocrine is really physiology. The three layers of the adrenal cortex, there's three layers here in the cortex made out of zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. And the three layers are the one that secretes aldosterone, cortisol, and your androgenic hormone. Okay, so I'm not really asking you anything about physiology. I'm just putting it in so that you can understand why we study this anatomy. Okay. All right, and then let's talk about your pancreas. Pancreas is generally for the digestive system. It will secrete digestive enzymes for digestion, but it also has cells here called islets of Langerhans cells. These cells are endocrine. So here are called the islets of Langerhans. The rest are actually cells that secrete enzymes. So the islets of Langerhans are actually a specific area where the cells produces what we call hormones. Okay. Now, if you take a look at the cells, we have two kinds of cells, alpha and beta islets, islet of Langerhans. So the beta one is the one that produces insulin, and the alpha is the one that produces glucagon. These are the two hormones of your pancreas. Okay. So the two hormones, if I do a seesaw, okay, and it's for the concentration of glucose, okay, the concentration of glucose, the insulin is to decrease glucose. Okay, insulin is to decrease glucose. Glucagon will increase glucose. Okay, glucagon will increase glucose. Okay, so insulin is the reason why when somebody is diabetic, it's because insulin is absent, okay, or decreased. So that's the reason why glucose becomes elevated, and that will actually produce what we call diabetes. Okay. Now, the two hormones act in a way to produce your glucose level normal. Insulin decreases glucagon increases sugar. Okay. And that is actually the function of the two hormones located in the pancreas. Right? So now we have normal level of glucose. Okay. If the glucose is too high, it will stimulate the release of what we call the beta cell secretion of insulin. So the insulin is elevated, it will tell the cells, hey, cells, put in the glucose. Don't let it stay in your blood. Okay. Put in the glucose. So that will decrease the amount of sugar in your blood. Now, if the sugar is too low, okay, it will then stimulate at your alpha cell islet of Langerhans to secrete what we call glucagon. Glucagon's purpose is to increase sugar level in the blood. Okay, so you have glucagon. Okay, and then glucagon now will actually increase the sugar level in the blood, and then from there, normal sugar level follows. Okay, all right. So now let's take a look at your other glands. Okay, so we're just at the end. So the other glands are going to be your endocrine glands. One is called pineal gland. And remember, we talked about pineal gland on the brain. And that is to secrete melatonin. Melatonin is the one that regulates circadian rhythm. It tells you when to be awake and when to be asleep. Okay. The other one is called thymus gland. Okay. Just located below the trachea, close to the heart. It secretes thymosin hormone. And the purpose of that is to promote the development of lymphocytes. Okay. So it has an important role of immunity. So lymphocytes are the one that actually fights cancer, fungus, and your virus. Okay. That's called thymosin. Right. And then the other hormones are the ovaries produce what we call estrogen. It also produces progesterone for pregnancy. Then testes produce testosterone. And then even the placenta produces estrogen, progesterone, and gonadotropins. Okay. And those are other endocrine glands. We're going to be looking at the thyroid gland, adrenal gland, thymus, pituitary, pineal. We're going to be the ovary and testes and the pancreas. Okay. So these are some of our models that we're going to be looking at. Okay. Now, the first one is going to be your pituitary gland. Remember, the pituitary gland is a gland just below the area below the hypothalamus. Okay. So remember, this is your hypothalamus. And the structure that's dangling down below the hypothalamus, that's going to be your pituitary gland. Okay. And what's actually highlighted here is the hypothalamus. And remember, the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. Okay. So this is how it looks like. Okay. On the models of the located at the brain. Okay. Another example, and this is going to be on a CT scan. So this part here is the hypothalamus. And remember, this structure looks like an egg. That is your thalamus. Hypothalamus is just below the thalamus. And the connection of the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, we call that the infundibulum. And the one below, that will be your pituitary gland. And remember, this part here of the bone is the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Okay, that's a pituitary gland. right? Right. So another picture, okay, again showing you the hypothalamus. Remember, hypothalamus is also an endocrine gland. The hypothalamus is the one that controls the pituitary gland here. Okay, and the connection between the hypothalamus and your pituitary gland, this part here, that is called the infundibulum. Okay, right? Now, this one is located at the back of the thalamus. Remember, this part is the egg-looking structure, that's your thalamus. So at the back of that, that is called your pineal gland. And the pineal gland is the one that secretes your melatonin hormone. Okay, so pineal gland is really part of the epithalamus. Okay, so the epithalamus part of that is going to be the pineal gland, and that's located at the back of the thalamus. Okay, now look at the thymus now. Okay, the thymus is just located below the trachea. So the trachea is here, and some of the thymus glands are located on the surface of the heart, of the superior anterior part of the heart. Okay, but on an infant, the thymus gland actually looks like a thyroid gland. It's bilobed and it looks like the same as a thyroid gland. But when we actually grow a little bit older, and it's going to be looking like it's diffused around the trachea and the anterior superior part of the surface of the heart. Okay, and that would be the thymus gland. And this is the schematic diagram of the thymus gland. It has two lobes. Okay, and one of the differentiating structure here inside the thymus gland is this corpuscle called the thymic corpuscle. Okay, the thymic corpuscle is where that gland is secreting. Okay, and sometimes we call it the Hazel's corpuscle. And this is located inside the thymus gland. Okay, again, your thymus gland is again also separated like the way the adrenal gland looks like. It has a cortex. The outer portion is called the cortex, and the inner portion is called the medulla. Okay, and within that medulla is where you see the thymic corpuscle or the Hazel's corpuscle. All right, another picture of the thymus gland. Okay, and thymus gland is going to be located here, just below the surface of your trachea. Okay, here's actually your thymus gland. Okay, so if you see in a microscope, the thymus gland within the medulla, okay, the area where the thymus gland is very important is the medulla, and it consists of this thymic corpuscle, or what we call the Hazel's corpuscle, and that's specific on for the thymus gland. So if there's a multiple choice question, where do you see the Hazel's corpuscle? The structure is going to be the thymus gland. Okay, so that is where the thymus gland is. So the cortex, okay, the cortex actually has this immature T cells, and then they're being stimulated to proliferate at the cortex. Okay, and they're also stimulated to mature. But the inner medulla, okay, is what's located there is actually defective T cells that will degenerate, and the mature T cells that is located in the medulla, they're the one that moves into the blood. Okay, so remember, this is where your T cells or your lymphocytes are actually created, and then once it becomes mature, they go to the blood. Okay, and remember, T cells are cells that are important for lymphocyte function. Okay, next, thyroid gland. Okay, thyroid gland is located on the second tracheal ring of the trachea. Okay, it's located there. And that is where the thyroid gland is. And this is how it looks like on a large portion. We're looking at the posterior part of the trachea and the larynx. And you see that the thyroid gland will wrap around the anterior part of the trachea and the larynx. Again, this is another picture of the thyroid gland. Okay, just on the second tracheal ring. This is one half. Okay, so the other half here was removed in order for us to see where that structure is located at, close to the trachea and the larynx. Okay, another picture in the thyroid gland. Okay, anterior part of the thyroid gland is shown on this picture. And when we look at the back of the thyroid gland, this is the posterior view. We can see small structures look like seeds on the back. And those are what we call the parathyroid gland. Okay. And remember, the parathyroid gland, that's the one that secretes your parathormone. Okay. The abbreviation of that, or the acronym, is PTH, parathormone. Okay. And then remember, the thyroid gland secretes two hormones, the thyroxine hormone and your calcitonin hormone. Now, we know that the thyroxine hormone increases metabolic activity. Okay, and then the calcitonin, that's the one, together with the parathormone, controls the calcium level in the blood. Okay, remember, we had a seesaw, and the seesaw controls calcium serum concentration. So the calcitonin decreases calcium level in the blood, okay? And then the parathormone, PTH, increases calcium level in the blood. So that's how it's depicted, okay, like a seesaw, in order to understand which is the one that decreases calcium level and which is the one that actually increases calcium level, okay? Now, this is the thyroid gland together with the parathyroid gland. So these are your thyroid gland. And remember, the posterior portion of the thyroid gland, you can see the parathyroid gland. Okay, that's going to be your parathyroid gland. Okay, so parathyroid gland is located in the posterior portion of your thyroid gland. So this is from a slide, okay, histology. Now, this again is from a cadaver. Now, if you take a look at the thyroid gland, okay, it's bilobed, but it also has another lobe called the pyramidal lobe. Okay, that is a pyramidal lobe, but you have the two lateral lobes to the side. Okay, and in between is called the isthmus. Isthmus connects the two lateral lobes to the side. Okay, isthmus connects the two lateral lobes on the slide on the side, and you have an extra one called the pyramidal lobe. Okay, and that's how it looks like on our cadavers. Okay, now next is going to be the pancreas. Okay, the pancreas is actually part of the digestive system, and usually you'll see it close to the duodenum. This portion here of the small intestine is called the duodenum. Duodenum is connected to the stomach. Okay, and the pancreas is the one that actually produces this fist-looking structure into the duodenum. Okay, that's the reason why the duodenum looks like C-shaped, okay, in structure. And then you can actually see also the pancreas, okay, right here, just above this large intestine, okay, to the back of the large intestine. That's what the pancreas is. Now, this is the exact location of the pancreas. So the pancreas looks like a fist that punches onto a structure called the duodenum. This duodenum is the one that looks like a letter C. So the pancreas is attached to the duodenum because remember, the duodenum is part of the digestive organ. So this duct is the one that creates your enzymes and they dump it onto the duodenum. But the hormonal or the endocrine glands are actually located on the tissue of the pancreas. And remember, this group of tissue looks like islands, okay? And we call it islet of Langerhans. The islet of Langerhans. And within the islet of Langerhans, there's two kinds. One is your alpha, islet of Langerhans. This is how it looks like in Greek. Then the other one is called beta. And this is how it looks like in Greek. Okay. So the alpha is the one that produces your glucagon. In the beta one, that's the one that produces your insulin. Okay. And remember, the insulin, the glucagon, again, seesaw, concentration of glucose in the blood. Okay. Insulin decreases sugar level in the blood. Glucagon increase sugar level in the blood. Okay. So this is, again, it's a depiction, okay, like a seesaw, right? Now at the tail of the pancreas, you see that spleen located here, okay? So the spleen and the pancreas is not attached to each other only because the blood vessels that supply the pancreas and the spleen are within the same area, okay? So usually the spleen is located at the tail of the pancreas. Again, another picture, okay, with the pancreas. So the pancreas close to the duodenum, okay? This is actually the duodenum. And then you see that at the tail of the pancreas is the spleen, okay? And so the spleen is actually, it's not connected, but it's actually close to the tail of the pancreas. That's going to be the spleen. Okay, this is going to be how it looks like in cadaver. Okay, so the pancreas has 4 parts. We have the head of the pancreas, we have the neck of the pancreas, we have the body of the pancreas, and then we have the tail of the pancreas. Okay, so those are the 4 parts of our pancreas. Okay, head, neck, the body, and the tail. Now, this is a CT scan of the pancreas. Again, this is the pancreas itself. Okay, and this would be your duodenum. It's always close to the duodenum, the head. So we have the head of the pancreas, we have the neck of the pancreas, and we have the body of the pancreas, and we have the tail of the pancreas. Okay, so that's how it's looked at on your CT scan. Now, inside the pancreas, okay, this is the histology of the pancreas. All the cells that you see here, okay, these are called assigner cells. They're the ones that actually secrete enzymes. And the purpose of the enzymes is for digestive process, okay? So that's the purpose of the assigner cells. They secrete what we call enzymes, digestive enzymes, for the use of the digestive process, secreted to the duodenum. But you see somewhat like islands that embedded onto the tissue of the pancreas. And these islands are what we call islets of Langerhans. So you see a lot of these islands dispersed around the pancreas. So the islet of Langerhans, when it secretes insulin, that type of islets of Langerhans is called beta. Okay? Because the alpha secretes glucagon. Okay, you won't be able to differentiate who's alpha or beta, but you see that both of them has islets of Langerhans. Another histology of the islets, okay, we have the islets, okay, these are the islets of Langerhans. That's your endocrine part. And whatever outside the islets, all of this green stuff that you see here, those are called assigner cells. So the assigner cells are for production of digestive enzymes. Okay. Next, we have the ovary. So the ovary is a reproductive organ, female, and you see that it's actually close to the fallopian tube. Okay, that's the ovary, and what's hugging around the ovary is called the fallopian tube. And remember, the organs are located in the pelvic cavity. Right. Next, again, another picture of your ovary. Okay, looking at the top view, the ovary is located here, and the fallopian tube is located here. Okay. Now, if you take a section of the ovary, you can see that this cells is actually the egg within the ovary. Okay. So these are called follicular cells. that are surrounding the egg. And then the middle part of that's the ovum, or what we call the egg. Okay. And remember, the egg is maturing inside the ovary. Okay. So the egg is maturing inside the ovary. So when the egg becomes mature, it will burst open from the ovary and then will jump to the fallopian tube. Okay. Remember, the egg will wait at the fallopian tube for the sperm. Okay. So it'll wait about 2 to 3 days. If there's no fertilization, it will just go down to the uterus and then go with the menstrual flow. Okay. So within the ovary are this developing oocyte. And that's actually the name of an egg. We call it an oocyte. Okay. All right. Now here again, the picture of the ovary hugging the fallopian tube. Okay. And this is what an ovary looks like. Okay. So now, if you notice that the egg starts as this small follicles. Okay. Inside of that is going to be the egg. Then they start maturing. Okay. And then it becomes what we call the secondary follicle, and then we have the matured follicle. Okay, and then we'll then develop into an egg that will rupture outside that follicle. So this is now the egg that is ruptured outside the ovary. And then the fallopian tube will then catch it. Okay. That's going to be the fallopian tube. And then the egg will then wait here for the sperm, for fertilization to occur. If fertilization happens here, it has to descend down to the uterus. And then the maturing fertilized egg will then stick into the uterus for the development into a fertilized egg. Okay. So another picture of the ovary, you can actually see that this part here is a follicle, a maturing follicle. Sometimes we call it the Graafian follicle. Then when the egg is mature, the egg will jump out from that follicle and then goes to the fallopian tube. Okay. And we'll see more, some of this again when we go to the reproductive system of the female. Okay, now we go to testes. The testes is located at the scrotum. Okay, that's where the sperm is actually produced or mature or even produced. Sperm is produced there and then they mature in the testes. And then from there to go up into the vas deferens, to lead up into the opening into the penis. Okay, so that is where the testis is, and got another picture of the testes. Okay, so that is where the sperm is produced and mature. Okay, and this is from the cadaver. This shows you about the testes inside the scrotum. Okay, so maturing sperms are located inside in the testes. Okay, and once they mature, they actually go through these tubes. Okay, the place where they mature is called the seminiferous tubule. Okay, it's a bunch of tube that's rolled up like a yarn. Okay, and then once they mature, they develop tails. Then they have to go through the tubes. And then when we go to the tubes, it goes through here and access the vas deferens. And then from there, it goes up. I'm sorry, this is the epididymis. And then after the epididymis, it goes up to what we call the vas deferens. And then from the vas deferens connects to the penis. Okay, so the eggs are located inside. Another picture of that, testes. You got these tubules, and these are called your seminiferous tubules located inside the testes. And that is where the sperm matures. Okay. And then another picture of the seminiferous tubules. So seminiferous tubules inside are tubes, and it has a lumen here. So the lumen is actually where the mature sperm will actually go out and connect to the tubes and then connect to the penis. Okay, So the mature sperm will then produce what we call tails. So these are your spermatozoans. It now develops tails, and then when it develops tails, it descends into the lumen. Okay, so you can see a lot of the spermatozoans that has tails. Another spermatozoan with tails, and then once they actually access the lumen, then it follows through the tubes connecting into the penis. Okay, and that is the spermatozoans, mature sperm. Now, this is a picture of a seminiferous tubule. One of them, it's a tube. Okay, remember, it's a tube. So your maturing sperm, okay, they don't have tails yet. They're going to be located at the walls. Okay, so when they become mature, they descend down. Okay, see down, they're actually going down. And then here, it's going down access to the lumen. The lumen is here. And once they develop the tails, okay, we consider that as your mature sperm. Then once they mature, they go to the lumen and pass on to the tubes to connect to the penis. Okay, and that is exactly where the testes is. Now the next one is going to be the adrenal gland. Okay, so where's the adrenal gland located at? That will be on top of the kidney. So the adrenal gland is located on top of the kidney. Okay, so another picture of the adrenal gland, it's going to be on top of the kidney. It's on both kidneys, on top of both kidneys. And another picture from the cadaver, that's the adrenal gland on top of the kidneys. Okay, another picture, the adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidney. Okay, this is your kidney. Okay, now we're going to cut open the adrenal gland to show you the two layers. So first of all, we have the medulla in the middle. Okay, that's going to be the medulla, and what's being shown here, from here to here, that is going to be the cortex. Okay, and remember the cortex is divided into three layers. The first one is called glomerulosa. That's the outside of the cortex. That's the first layer. Okay, and the next layer is the fasciculata. Remember G, F. Okay, and the last layer is going to be the reticularis. Okay, I think my medulla is actually very small right there. That's my medulla. This one is going to be the reticularis. Okay, so the three layers are GFR: glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. Okay, let's actually do a cross section of that again. This is going to be the capsule, the outside covering of the adrenal gland. And then after that, you're going to see that the cortex. This is all the cortex. Into here. So these are your cortex. And then underneath that is going to be the medulla. Remember, the medulla has your adrenaline hormones, which is sometimes called the epinephrine or the norepinephrine. Okay, and then so let's look at the cortex. We have the glomerulosa. Then the second layer, fasciculata. And the third layer, reticularis. We have three layers of the cortex above the medulla. Now, if you take a look at the layers, you're going to see again the cortex, the capsule is the covering. The cortex is here, and the medulla is all you see in the middle. Now, again, the capsule is the covering, and the first layer is the glomerulosa. Okay, and the next layer is the fasciculata, and the last layer is going to be the reticularis, and then this one is your medulla. So we have the cortex divided into GFR. Okay, now the specific hormones that are exactly produced within that cortex, the G, the glomerulosa, it secretes the aldosterone hormone. Okay, and the fasciculata and reticularis, That's the one that secretes cortisol and androgens. And then the medulla, that secretes what we call the catecholamines, which is going to be epinephrine or norepinephrine. Or generally, we call it the adrenaline hormones. Okay, so my glomerulosa, aldosterone, my fasciculata, and reticularis is cortisol and androgenic hormone. And that's for our adrenal gland, okay? And this should be our last one. So this is your thymus gland. On a fetus, it actually looks like a bilobe structure, but when it becomes adult, sometimes you don't even see the thymus gland, but we still have thymosin hormone. Because remember, when we grow older, the immunity of our body becomes lesser. Okay, so the thymus gland becomes thinner, and that's the reason why we succumb to a lot of our immune problems. Okay, so that's going to be the thymus, and the hormone that it secretes is called your thymosin hormone for maturity of the T cells, lymphocytes.